Alright, so here we are back in Illustrator, and this next assignment is about using gradients. We're going to go over a few things, probably pretty much a big number of things concerning gradients, but our main concern is to make a design that employs the use of gradients throughout the design. This cat here that I made this a couple years ago, is a pretty good example of a gradient-based design. If we're looking at it, we can see that there's gradients all over, from this light color to a darker color here, same from here to here. On the paws, there's gradients all over the piece. And if you're unsure what a gradient is, it's pretty straightforward. You just grab a box, and you can see this is a gradient because it goes from one color to another. We're going to be going over some of the basics of gradients in Illustrator, as well as how it can be applied to a design, such as an animal. I'm not giving, again, any content restrictions as to what your design should be. That said, I will be demoing with the idea and the intent of doing animals, and I would encourage you to do the same if you're stumped for an idea. Pick an animal, sketch it out, and try to think about how you can use gradients to bring more detail to the piece. A lot of this will have to deal with lighting, figuring out where our light source is. There's a very clear light source coming from the top right here on this piece, and then shifting down to the main body of the piece, we have our shadows sort of along the back end on this piece as well. So where we put our piece and where we place those gradients, a lot of it has to do with determining a light source with our piece. So let's look at some examples of gradients, starting over here. Here's just a few examples. Starting with just a sphere here, you can see how we can use multiple gradient shifts to get this idea of light across. This one right here is maybe simulating a button, and maybe a more cartoony, flat design style here, kind of like in our previous building piece, but with some gradients applied to make it a little bit more dynamic. So when we're setting up a gradient in Illustrator, you really do want to pick your colors ahead of time. So let's say I'm going to do some type of sphere like this that's going to go from a light color to a dark color. I might want to pick what that base color is going to be. And a good way to think of things is really just in terms of a base, a shadow, and a light color. You might have more colors intermixed in here, but it's completely fine just to start with three and then kind of work your way up from there. So I'm going to pick three colors here, maybe do like a blue sphere. So if this is my main color, my shadow color will probably go a little bit cooler, so I'll move a little bit towards the cooler color here, back towards blue, and again, darker. You can decide if you want more saturated, less saturated. I like a little saturation in my darker colors, so I tend to bump it up a little bit. Some people dull out their shadows a little bit more, but I think that'll work for this shadow for that one. And for the bright color, we'll go a little bit brighter. And depending on what type of light you want, you might go warmer. Like if this is supposed to be being hit with like a yellow light or a warm light, I might move a little bit more towards a warmer color, or I might move more towards a cooler color depending on what I'm doing. I'll go a little bit lighter here and brighten it up. So this could be a nice three color palette for my design. I'm actually going to go to my swatches window here, and we're going to go ahead and do just color groups here. And we're going to use color groups like we did in the previous assignment to sort of group all our gradient colors together. And I might add more colors to this depending, but this should be an okay start for getting a sphere onto the screen. So I'll hit new color group, and we'll call this something like blue palette or something. I totally spelt the word palette wrong, I'm pretty sure. But we'll hit OK. Make sure you have global process on. And now we have those three colors. So let's go ahead and make a sphere now. And I'll start with my base color, just that middle blue color in there. And we're going to go to our gradient window now. You can access gradients in like a number of places. Like if I change this to a gradient, I'll get gradient options over here. But I do suggest just going to the window menu and selecting gradient so that you have that gradient window up. And you have some basic gradient options here. You have linear, radial, and something called freeform, which I might touch on a little bit, but it's a little bit more confusing in some ways. But we'll start with just the linear gradient here. You can see we have our design here, and we have these little sliders. You can actually just grab and replace these colors with pieces from your swatch. So now I have that nice gradient from a light color to the dark color. You do have this gradient bar here, so it's important to note that you have the gradient tool. And if you're on that and you're clicking and dragging, you can control and edit the angle of the gradient, how tight or how distant some of the colors are from one another. I would play around with it, drag some of the points around, see how it looks, but it's pretty intuitive. It's maybe a little bit harder on the radial gradient, which we're about to get to. So again, set your colors up first so that you have them in your swatches, so that way you can drag them into your gradient window, pretty easily replacing whatever the default gradient is. If you need to remove a stop, you can hit delete. You can also just bring that stop back in just by clicking and dragging that piece back into it. You also have opacity here, which is really important, so you can actually turn opacity off, and that way you can get a fade to basically invisible, and that can be really handy for doing more highlights and more sort of cast shadows where you might want soft shadows in some areas that blend around with different areas of a piece to get an interesting effect. So I'm going to leave this on 100 here, and let's switch to radial gradient. So with radial gradient, we can again go to that gradient tool here. If I want to get that sphere look, I might pull from right here. And you can see how that feels more like a 3D sort of sphere, and a little bit more intense and more realistic than just if I had the gradient set up normally. Maybe I want to add another color into here. I think I could get one more deeper shade of blue for sort of my core shadow. Maybe a color like that. And we'll add that to our swatches. Make it global as well. And again, it's as easy as just pulling stuff across and then dragging in that new gradient color in there so that I can get that third color, well, fourth color into my piece. I might actually copy out my farther blue color, my sort of like middle blue, just to get that idea of like reflected light there, which can look pretty interesting. And then go to my gradient tool, and I can make this a little bit wider. You can also change like the general scale, and you can change if you want more of like an ovalish shape on that radial gradient as well, which I might do, and then maybe I'll rotate it a little bit like that. Go a bit bigger. So another thing we can do here is add a sort of reflected light, like which is going on down here. This is just a shape with a slow glow on the bottom, just to give an idea of reflected light that overlays nicely on top of that shape to give it a little bit more dimension. I can do that just by copying the circle. We'll paste it in front with Control F. That way we get two copies of our sphere. And on this one right here, I'm just going to start deleting out some of these. Actually, just reset it to black and white, and then we will change these colors to just have a little bit of color, maybe like a little bit of like a warm green, and then we will actually copy this color out by holding Alt and dragging it, and we'll delete out that black one on the side. And right here, we will go ahead and drop that far one to an opacity of 0. And we'll switch to the gradient tool. We'll inverse this here in this case. And I'll go to my gradient tool, and we'll pull this out. The main goal, just getting a little bit on the bottom there. We'll crunch this down. And this can be a good way to just add a little bit of reflected light onto your piece. I'm thinking maybe a little bit more on that right-hand side. Again, just something subtle that might add another little extra piece of dimension to the piece right there. So that's the basics of gradients there. And just to kind of go over some of the other points here, if I have a shape, again, you can apply a gradient. Let's just do a black and white gradient here. You can do radial, linear. The last one is freeform. This one gives you like sort of these quadrant points, and you can just click and drag colors onto those points, and you can do sort of like this freeform mesh of a gradient. So it's a little bit different, but it can be very handy for getting sort of interesting backgrounds or more free-flowing colors within a design. So let's add a little bit more context to this and take a look at this button that I made here. So this button is using just gradients to create an illusion of sort of space and a little bit of form onto the piece. So to create this button, what I did was I started with a rectangle. I think I rounded it. And I'm just going to use grayscale here. So I'm not going to do any sort of swatch layouts here. So I'll just start with these sort of basic colors. So with this button design, I'm getting this idea of like sort of layering gradients, and I'm also starting to pick a light source. Um, just like with the sphere, we have a light source coming in from the top left, and this one we're going to do a light source coming in. This is a button that's sort of depressed, so that if you were looking at it from the side, it would actually kind of like divot down, so that you could like sort of fit your finger into the button groove. So that's why some of the gradients are looking the way they do here. So to start this off, I'm going to go ahead and grab a circle. And a nice thing we can do here is use some things like blurs to sort of soften up shapes. So with this shape here, I'm going to pick a darker color. It's sort of like an inside shadow color. And I'm going to go ahead and do Effect, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And this is a nice way, again, just to soften the edge of a shape. So you can see in here how that feels a little bit more tight. This is an effect, so it actually shows up in the appearance window here on the properties. I can go to Gaussian Blur and kind of soften it up a little bit. I think it should be a little harder than that, so I'll go maybe down to 5. That's feeling a little bit better. And let's add in our button next. Again, going to the circle tool. We'll drag this out. And with this one, I'm going to be using mainly linear gradients. You might think that because it's radial that I would use like a bunch of radial gradients in nature, but they're actually more flat, just plain circles. So I'll start by picking up my main base color there. And we'll actually switch out here. Maybe I will make a quick color group, even though I said I wasn't going to. Just so that's there. And we'll turn this into a gradient. This one, again, just going to be linear. We'll go 90 degrees here. Start to figure out what these colors should end up being. And if I want to edit a color, you can actually double click on it, and this will bring up sort of like your general color editor. If I click right here, I can go to CMYK. I'm just looking to darken up that edge there. And that's looking all right. I think it's actually going to go the opposite direction, so I'll do -90 so that the light's hitting the edge of the button. I could soften this one up too if I wanted to, but I'm actually going to do that in the interior button layout. So I'm actually going to go to my radial tool, my circle tool again. We're going to go a little bit in, like maybe right around there. And for this one, I'm going to pick a darker color, which is already sort of set up in there. So I'll actually copy this one out. We'll get rid of that light color for now. And you can see how that feels like sort of like the edge or bevel of a button right there on the edge. And on our lighter color, it's looking about right. We'll go to radial on this one actually because it is a concave button. And for this one, I will pull it out from the bottom down here. And hopefully you can see how that feels, again, like a button shape. And this one will actually do well to have the blur effect on it as well, just to soften up our shape. And that's how you can create sort of like a realistic or like semi-realistic looking button. It's actually something called skeuomorphism, um, where we're trying to like imitate the look of a real button that you might see on like a device of some sort. If I wanted to go a little bit further on this piece right here, I could probably also add a gradient to this. And that's sort of how we can create, again, layering gradients on top of each other, a sense of depth within a piece. This one's a little bit more developed on the left-hand side, but the basic concept stands with that right-hand side one. And if we're looking at something more graphical, illustrative in nature, where we're moving away from just like sort of like shapes or like buttons or whatever, you can see how that's coming into play here on this deer shape. And it's really just using gradients on top of our base shapes to create a little bit more depth within a piece. So if I'm starting with a piece like this deer face right here, I can grab this down there. I'll go over how I made this eye, just to give you an idea of how you can start layering these things on top of each other. I'm going to start by picking my eye color here. And I was going for more of this football shape here. Let's make sure that we're not having a gradient on right now, so I'll just pick a base color so that I can get away from that. All I'm going to do is copy the shape by holding Alt while I'm on my selection tool. I can grab both of these, go to my shape builder tool, which is right here, hold Alt, and delete out the parts I don't want. I left kind of a mirror copy there for some reason. And let's go ahead and add in the pupils. Just had to reset some settings there. Again, if you like eyedropper a gradient, it's going to make whatever you have selected a gradient as well. That's kind of where I'm messing up a little bit. That looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and delete this top part. Again, shape builder, just hold Alt and you can delete that part there. So now I have the basic sort of like eye shape here. And I might want to add in a few other details using gradients. So one thing I can do here is add gradients to my actual base shapes here. So again, I'll start by making a color group here of these two colors so that I just have them quickly loaded. And for this one right here, we can go to, again, a basic gradient. Just drop in our purple color, grab one of these, and on this one right here, we'll probably go a little bit darker. And maybe this ends up being a little bit more blue. And I'll go to my gradient tool to sort of shift where that's going to be. I think sort of lighter on the bottom makes sense. And this will be the same for the actual part of the eye as well. We'll go for a basic gradient. I can just go for this one to start with. Drag in our colors. Make sure we're going to CMYK there, and we'll go a little bit more yellow. And that looks pretty good, and I think I'll go for the radial gradient here. Right around there feels okay. Again, we're just trying to get a little bit of depth with these gradients. We're not really trying to like push it an insane amount or anything. And then I do have this sort of like reflection light on top. So I'll talk about how I make a piece like this right here. It will be pretty similar to what happened right here with the blue sphere. I'm actually going to go for my pen tool. Because remember when we click with the pen tool, we can click and drag out curves. This one actually already has that gradient applied because I selected earlier. But we'll start by picking sort of like a base color to begin with. We'll just pick a black or a white. And I'll just drag out a curve. And when I'm dragging this curve, I'm really thinking about that surface of the eye, that it's curved and that my line should curve around with it. This back half doesn't matter because I'm just going to delete it. So I'll select this, hold Shift, select that part, go to my Shape Builder tool, hold Alt, and delete. And then for this right here, we'll apply a gradient. And this one's actually already set up here, but you can see that it's an opacity of 0 on one end of white, and then an opacity of 100 on the other. That way I can get sort of this shine that blends out on the piece that can add a little bit of depth to the illustration. If you want to go further, I could even add maybe like a little spot of reflection down here, and have that be that same gradient. The idea being that this is a reflective surface and that it's picking up some of the light from wherever this animal's eye might be in. And that's the basics of some of this flat design with some gradients on top. You can add some shading as well, which we can go over by talking about sort of like this mouthpiece down here. So to create that mouth, I actually end up creating two more circles. Put this one over here. I'm actually going to go to my reflect tool, which is right here. And we'll find the center of the circle, hopefully. Probably right around there. If you click, that will put the reflection point down there, and then I can drag this over, hold Alt and Shift while I do it. Now if I select all this, you can see we actually get that mouse shape down there. I'm going to go to my shape builder tool. We'll combine these shapes right there. Minus out that, minus out that. And now I have this mouth shape for this sort of deer face. And you could start just by simply having this be sort of some basic colors to begin with, and then adding shading on top, which I'm going to do with this method. So let's go ahead and add in a nose shape, which I'm just going to use a circle for. Forgot to turn off the gradient, so we'll just pick a basic color, and we'll tone that down a little bit. I'm going to start pretty basic here too with this. Just pick like a base color, and we'll make this mouth shape actually the same color as that to begin with. So it will actually look like nothing all that interesting is happening. So to add some shading to this, what I can do is actually use some basic shapes to add in a little bit of interest with the design. So this mouth will probably have a shadow down here as the cheeks kind of like fold over onto the design. So let's go ahead and add a secondary shape on top of this. I'm actually just going to go ahead and copy this shape, paste it in front with Control F, so that way I have two shapes on top of each other. And this one right here, I'm going to go for a shadow form. So remember, we want to pick our colors first. So let's go over here and figure out what our color palette for this deer is going to be. Let's go maybe a little bit more beigeous. So that might be by base color. Let's figure out some of our highlights and shadows. So when I pick a highlight color here, you don't ever want to like shade with black or anything. So I'm really looking for like sort of like some tones here. Maybe we'll go a little bit cooler. That could be a good shadow color. And let's go for a lighter tint up here. Let's get just a touch warmer. And these three colors right here could work pretty well for my piece. I think I'm going to go one step darker just in case though. So let's kind of grab these colors and see what starts to happen. Again, as I said, you should have a duplicate down here. So I'm going to copy this and paste it down with Control F. So we have two copies. And instead of doing like a custom gradient here, I'm actually just going to do a gradient that's going to be set to a blend mode so that it can blend with that base color underneath. So this is another method of sort of building up our character. So let's go ahead and pick a gradient. We'll make this a color group. And for this one, I'm going to go from our dark color to our base. And on that base color, I'm actually going to drop the opacity to 0. So that way we're going to get a blend happening out here. So you can now see how that looks. And just kind of messed up some of the colors there. So I'm actually going to go ahead and reset this. Control copy, Control F. So now you can see how that looks just on top right there. And I can just use a basic blend out like that. Now I have a nice shadow shape that sort of casts from our dark shadow to our lighter color. We can do a blend mode on this by going to our opacity window, selecting something like multiply to get a little bit more intense with those colors. And you can also drop out the opacity if you want to find that balance. So all this shape looks like is a piece that blends from the dark color out to sort of a invisible version of the base color to add that sense of shadow onto the piece. Maybe I want to add a highlight up here. I'm going to grab this shape and I'm going to copy it and I'm going to paste it down in place with Control F. So again, we have two copies. And I'm going to get like a little bit of a border in here actually. I'm going to do that by doing something called offset path on the right hand side. And we're going to do a sort of like maybe negative 0.1, see how that looks. Maybe a little bit smaller, negative 0.7. This would be 0.07. Just trying to get like a little bit of a edge to this. And this is going to be a highlight for my deer head. And on this shape right here, we will again use a gradient. And for this one, I'm just going to do two colors. I'm just going to do the highlight color by clicking and dragging that onto it. And then the base color, which is already set up. Make this a little tighter, and we'll go to our maybe radial right here. We'll reverse that out. Maybe we keep it linear. I think that linear works a little bit better, but that way I can have this sort of beam of light on the right-hand side that kind of blends out onto the body of the deer. I could add some shadows underneath the eyes as well, and I can do that just by doing some simple sort of radial shapes underneath the eye that could work pretty nicely for shadows. So let's set this up. We're going to do a ellipse here, and we're going to do a basic radial, and we're just going to drag in our shadow color. We're actually going to put the shadow color on both ends, and we'll have one be an opacity of 0 and the other one have an opacity of 100. So this right here is just a dot of color. But if I put this right underneath the eye, you can see how this can nicely bring, again, a little bit more dimension to the piece by adding some shadows underneath a feature of our cartoon here. So that's some of the basics here of using gradients to create a more illustrative design going onto this piece. I did want to talk briefly about sort of the construction of maybe a more complicated eye like this. It might look pretty complicated, but now that you know what's going into all this, you actually see that if I start removing stuff, it's really just a series of overlapping shapes that have gradients on them. But you pull it all together in the right order, and you end up with a design that feels like it has like a lot of depth to it. But I'm just using some of those spot highlights for reflections, and then the base shape itself is pretty much a variation on one of our spheres. And that's again happening here on this cat. I think maybe where I'm making some more interesting decisions here is when it comes to like this foot here. It actually blends out invisible, which I don't realize why I have 3 feet there, but actually does that blend out to an invisible color there. So that way I can get this sort of more blended look on something that's supposed to feel connected. All right, so up next, I'm just going to go ahead and make a design from scratch, keeping these ideas of gradients in mind to give you an idea of what maybe an end product might look like for this assignment. So you don't have to do animals for it. I'm going to keep with that theme. I've been playing a lot of Animal Crossing, so I'm going to use that as like a starting reference to maybe come up with a character for my design. Feel free to do whatever you might like to. Again, if you can't use Illustrator, I would be looking for the principles of sort of gradual change in color to be present in your design in whatever material you're making it in. And always keep in mind that you should have some type of background element for your design so it's not just floating on white space. So in the end, you have something that's fully presentational. So with that, we'll go ahead and you can watch this video and see how the piece ends up. All right, and right there about does it for the design here. There's some stuff I'm not quite happy with, but I think for the amount of time I put in, it should be an okay looking piece. There's a few spots here where some cutting went wrong. Couldn't quite line up this gradient for some reason. But overall, you can see that the gradients do add like a nice pop to this design here. If I were to continue, I could add more detail. I never quite figured out the mouth. I would definitely troubleshoot that. I probably should have built those mouthpieces to begin with way back in the beginning. But I think the eyes look good. I think the hair looks all right, and the horns look all okay as well. So this is a pretty cute design. I'll go ahead and export it as a PNG or save it as a PNG. If you can share your AI file, if you can't do that, just the PNG is fine as well. The AI file does help out. I'm naming this guy Doug for some reason. I think that's an appropriate name for him. Um, I can go down to export, save for web, and we'll do PNG here. And remember, you can change your size up as needed for your piece. I'll do about 1,000 pixels here to keep it on the larger size.